Now, as much as I love talking about Siege Rhino and Corsair Crew Fix and Sylvan Caryatid and Doomwake Giants, and that stuff's all sweet, and we'll see plenty of that today, I know what you guys are here for. You're here for brainstorms. You're here for treasure cruises and Delver of Secrets, and we're going to have a lot of that too. We might get some Infect splashed in there because, again, Tom Ross is in the building looking to go back to back to back in Invitationals. But the big thing that's happened in Legacy over the past couple of months, ever since Constant Heroes was released, it's those Delve cards. It's Treasure Cruise. It's Dig Through Time. They're both obscenely powerful cards, and I know that you have some pretty strong feelings about the Cruise and its effect on Legacy.
I think, I mean, first of all, just to be clear, I think Legacy is a format that can handle some pretty broken stuff going on. Dig Through Time and Treasure Cruise and Dig Through Time are definitely in that space. I mean, one mana draw 3 is out of control good, and we've been seeing that for quite a while now with like the Legacy Opens being very dominated by decks containing one of these two cards, Treasure Cruise or Dig Through Time. And it seems like you always see one or the other, and occasionally people will use a bunch of one and then one of the other just to have even more of it. Yep. I think this weekend in particular is going to be very, very important for the shaping the next year of Legacy play, the next several months at the very least of Legacy play, because this is the last major event, I believe, for before the Legacy banned and restricted list announcements. So I think that combined with the fact that we're in Seattle, we're in Wizards of the Coast's own backyard, there's going to be Wizards of the Coast people here watching, studying intently to see, is Legacy broken? Is the format going to get too warped? Or can we give it 3 more months to see what direction it goes? Because, you know, as warping as Dig Through Time and Treasure Cruise have been in Modern, it's less clear that Legacy can't handle it. It's possible they can. I mean, Legacy has things like Jace the Mind Sculptor, Show and Tell, you know, Glimpse of Nature. Like there's some really, really busted card drawers. So it's not clear that Dig Through Time and Treasure Cruise are too much for the format, but I think this weekend is going to be very telling. If we see one or the other, or both, if we see those cards overly dominant this weekend, you know, if we see 7 copies of Delver in the top 8, that's going to send a very, very strong signal about where Legacy is at right now.
And you and I have done a lot of coverage. It's not out of the question.
Well, it slots in so naturally to the play patterns that are already powerful in Legacy, which is part of the problem with the cards, if there is one. The mana bases are already defined by fetch lands, Flooded Strand and Polluted Delta and so forth. Brainstorm's the most powerful card in the format. Ponder and Gataxian Probe really aren't that far behind, and that already sets up a nice infrastructure for casting Treasure Cruise. Now, as you alluded to, a pretty good answer to beating Treasure Cruise and Dig Through Time is to kill your opponent on the first or second turn before they can cast Treasure Cruise, and there's plenty of decks in Legacy that can do exactly that. So if those cards are actionable, I think it's more likely that they present a problem in Modern than they do in Legacy. That said, Treasure Cruise and to a lesser extent Dig Through Time have been all over the place since Concept here got printed. In fact, the first Open where that set was legal in New Jersey was won by 4X Treasure Cruise, 4X Monastery Swiftspear, week 1, and it's very rare we see that level of new content incorporated that quickly into Legacy. So Treasure Cruise and Dig Through Time clearly defining cards. They may be actionable, as you alluded to. Wizards is going to be here. They're going to have an opportunity to watch the format before the banned and restricted update occurs, before the next set gets released. We'll see if anything happens, but I expect Treasure Cruise and Dig Through Time to be all over the top tables.
Those cards have had a huge impact, obviously.
Massively. They've redefined it.
They've, as you said, redefined is the perfect word to use because it's changed what people have to do now. You know, those cards having a huge impact has made those decks that we have seen before with Himatorak, with Thoughtseize, with Deathrite Shaman, and most notably Abrupt Decay, those things are basically gone now. So these black strategies that we saw a lot, be it your Juns, be it your Sultais, we don't see them as much anymore. Do you think it's a good time for a comeback for Abrupt Decay?
No, not as long as Treasure Cruise is legal.
Fair enough.
I'll be honest with you.
Fair enough.
I think it's just Treasure Cruise is just too brutal against them. I do think we're going to see a sideways kind of evolution towards the super fast combo decks that Patrick was talking about. But also, I do think that Counterbalance, if Counterbalance and Dig Through Time ever become big, that's Abrupt Decay's moment.
Okay.
They're already gaining some steam with things like Miracles with Counterbalance using Dig Through Time. That deck's been that deck's been popular in the SCG Opens for quite some time, but it's been gaining some steam in the last few months. If that ever passes Delver, that's the moment I think that Abrupt Decay can come back. But I just think that Abrupt Decay is just, the Abrupt Decay decks are just too soft to Treasure Cruise itself because they spend 2 mana to get rid of 2 cards with Himatorak, and that just makes the Treasure Cruise cost 2 mana less.
Sure.
So that when they draw 3 cards, they only have to spend 1 mana.
Yep.
your major incentive to playing a deck right now cannot be spot removal. Some of it's still good, and the blue-red Delver decks are still playing with Fork Bolts and Lightning Bolts, so we know those cards are fine. But you can't point to a deck and say, I'm playing this because of Abrupt Decay, or because of Deathrite Shaman, or because of Liliana the Veil, or any of those, you know, good one-for-one in attrition battle type of cards, because all of your good removal gets blown up the minute that Treasure Cruise resolves.
Sure.
So you can play those cards if you want to, but you still have to have a plan for beating Treasure Cruise, and a lot of these decks like Sultai don't really have a very good plan. I do like speeding up and playing combo decks in this format because a lot of people have cut cards like Spell Pierce to make room for Treasure Cruise. People just always want to be able to resolve the cards in their hand because that's what you want to do once Treasure Cruise is in your deck. So kind of these fidgety reactive cards are not as powerful as they used to be. And I think the Delver decks are giving up percentage points against decks like Storm as a result. So I think we might see more combo decks in the tournament this weekend than we have seen in the Open Series over the last month or two. I think you'll see Elves and some of the other creature-based combo decks, but those are already soft to Lightning Bolt and Fork Bolt to an extent. If I was going to play a combo deck in this tournament, I would want to ignore creatures altogether, play something like Storm. Even Belcher, I think, could be a legitimate choice for this tournament.
I've already talked to someone who said they're playing Oops All Spells.
Yeah, I think people are cutting down on Spell Pierces because of Treasure Cruise, and that's a good time for decks like Belcher and Storm to make a resurgence.
Wouldn't surprise me one bit. Now, one deck that we haven't really talked about very much, so it does incorporate Treasure Cruise, and maybe Dig Through Time, depending on how you want to build the deck, is the deck that won Grand Prix New Jersey, which was Jeskai Stoneblade by Brian Bronduin, and we haven't seen a lot of that deck past that tournament. A little spattering here and there, but by and large, you know, the narrative is it's Treasure Cruise all the time. You just figure out what deck you want to put it in, and that makes me think of Stoneforge Mystic. And of course, that card's powerful. Some believe that it is the most powerful creature of all time. Wink, wink. And it's actually pretty hard to argue given its success and the fact that it was a card that was banned in Standard, you know, which is something we don't see very often. So when I think of Stoneforge Mystic, I think of either Jeskai Stoneblade, Death and Taxes. There's a lot of homes for that card. We saw Maverick last weekend when in Portland. Didn't have Stoneforge in it, but you could have Stoneforge in that deck. How do we feel about Stoneforge Mystic moving forward? Is it a good card to have for this tournament?
I think it's totally defensible. It just comes down to whether or not you want to be on the Stoneforge Mystic Treasure Cruise side or the blue-red Delver and be more burn-oriented. Whether or not, you know, I think that Stoneforge Mystic, there's this dynamic metagame in Legacy right now of Stoneforge Mystic versions of Treasure Cruise or Dig Through Time. Sometimes the Sultai Treasure Cruise Dig Through Time deck, sometimes Miracles with Dig Through Time. And I think Stoneforge Mystic is great against the creature decks because a lot of people like decks like Death and Taxes, you know, or Maverick or anything in that area against blue-red Delver because their creatures are too big and too hard to Lightning Bolt. And they have cards like Thalia, which are just super good against somebody who tries to play a flurry of spells to power their Treasure Cruise. Those people, however, are the ones who are most vulnerable to Stoneforge Mystic because the ability to Stoneforge down a Batterskull can dominate fair strategies. And Swords to Plowshares kills the creatures like Knight of the Reliquary, which we're counting on being too hard to Lightning Bolt.
Fair.
And a lot of these, I think that Stoneforge Mystic has gotten a little bit worse in the abstract, just because these blue-red decks, again, they can bolt your Stoneforge Mystic rather, and back in the old play patterns, that was fine because you would resolve a second Stoneforge Mystic, and then they would have to kill that. Or eventually you would get to 5 mana and just cast your Batterskull, and that was good enough to win the game. Nowadays, that's being fueled by Treasure Cruise. That play pattern isn't as good as it used to be. But in the metagame sense, a lot of the decks that people go to fight blue-red Delver, decks like Maverick, like Death and Taxes, that have these big, good creatures that you can't really bolt. They're good at blocking. They're disruptive towards spells. Those strategies are soft to control decks that have Stoneforge Mystic. So I think that if you're trying to metagame the room, Stoneforge Mystic is a totally reasonable choice, but in the abstract, it has gotten worse since the printing of Treasure Cruise.
Part of it is that Stoneforge Mystic decks use more powerful of spells than some of the other, like some of the blue-red Delver decks, for instance. Blue-red Delver has a lot of one-for-one action, like Lightning Bolt, Forked Bolt, Daze, you know, very small battles. Whereas the Stoneforge Mystic deck is more likely to have things like, I mean, Batterskull's obviously a big thing, but it could have things like Jace the Mind Sculptor or Wrath of God or Supreme Verdict. And these bigger spells don't lend themselves as well to Treasure Cruise, which is really having a warping impact. I think that if we see combo decks if combo decks are big, I think that blue-red Delver is the better way to do it because of how they can combat the combo decks.
Sure.
If they want to set up against it. But if we see creature decks as a fight against the Delver decks, that's where Stoneforge Mystic is going to shine.
Now, what's the move people are going to make this weekend? That's the big question. It's hard to guess. Legacy, what's part of what makes the format great is that you can basically win with anything. Again, we had been talking about Maverick a little bit here in the Open Series, and it actually came to fruition last week, and David McDarby winning in Portland with that deck. Do I expect a repeat performance? I got no idea. The last two invitations was won by Infect, and no one else can really get it done besides Tom Ross. We're talking about Treasure Cruise. He had one in his deck across those two tournaments. So who knows? That's what makes I can see a lot of fun. We can see Burn crop up with Treasure Cruise, without. Again, that's something we don't know. The only thing that we do know is that Legacy is going to be dynamic. It's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to see a lot of rounds of it this weekend as well. So be sure to stay tuned for that later this weekend too, as we do make our way through the rounds here of our Invitational, which will be starting shortly here. However, that does it for our Legacy preview, and we'll get ready here for the Invitational in just a second.
I predict